All right, during the spring semester, which was a hybrid semester, a lot of faculty were teaching online. Some were teaching in the classroom. We were trying to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to sort some things out. I put together a workshop series focusing on faculty scholarship and research. We're really trying to push publications, submissions to journals, um, book reviews, conference presentations. We're trying to encourage faculty to do more research or to start a research program. And a lot of faculty consider themselves to be teaching experts and have never really thought of themselves as research experts. And so in the research and scholarship series that I put together, what I tried to do is show how research and teaching support one another. And one of those workshops ended up being really helpful, I think, or really, well, hopefully they were all helpful, but one of them was really popular. A lot of faculty afterwards connected with me asking for how to move forward even more, and so I wanted to put together a video that could hopefully be treated like a workshop. And so if you're watching this and you're hoping to put this to practice, you have your sheet of paper out, or maybe you have a document open on your desktop, and you'll be able to start planning a research project. I have two types of people in mind for this presentation or workshop, this video. The first is the teaching-only professor or perhaps teacher. This is the person that prides themselves in being an excellent teacher. They think of themselves as someone who puts students first. They're really interested in promoting or facilitating significant learning, and they spend the majority of their time outside of class preparing for class or planning activities, curricula, and so forth. So this is the teaching-focused professor or teaching-focused teacher. The other person that I think would benefit from this video or from this workshop is the early career scholar, professor, researcher who wants to begin a research program but isn't sure exactly where to start. And so maybe they've already started teaching, maybe this group has already started teaching and learning a little bit about what works in the classroom and what doesn't, but are actively trying to find that area of research to be invested in. Maybe there's their initial focus from their dissertation or graduate school days, but trying to diversify their research portfolio. What's that next step going to be? And I'm going to suggest making teaching or the scholarship of teaching, or maybe your student learning, as that focus. So on the one hand, the teaching experts, we'll call them, who want to become even better, and then the early career scholar or professor who wants to diversify their research program or get something started. And so what I want to do is talk about how to do that and how you already have some of the hardest parts done already. You've already crossed off the items that are the most difficult to get, which is experience-based. And so you've already got a great experience base upon which to work and develop really neat research programs. And then hopefully that will facilitate better teaching and learning, which will facilitate even more nuanced research projects. And before you know it, you will have spent 5 years becoming perhaps a national expert on what your area of focus is in your discipline and the teaching strategies that you've perfected. And you'll be the go-to person for that. And that'll be maybe in addition to the research that you're already doing. So this fits into a pretty common model of scholarship and research promoted by Ernest Boyer. So I think his famous book was published 30 years ago or so. When you look at scholarship and research in the middle of the 20th century, I'm reminded of the book Organization Man by, if I'm not mistaken, William White. He spent a chapter looking at research, and what counted as research was the externally funded grant research. This is not-for-profits or government organizations or private corporations that would hire researchers to do specific research projects, and they would get paid. They would get paid handsomely for it, and that's what like real research was. You were testing whether it's in engineering or manufacturing or organizational studies or teaching and learning over broad scales. This is like the real research. And so there was a critique there that there was no scholarship anymore. William White was recognizing that there are few, even in the 40s and 50s, there are few scholars left that pursue inquiry with no ulterior motives. They do so through the nature of discovery and exploration without any sort of push. But anyway, in higher education or in faculty life, this emphasis on research, there's sort of a hierarchy of what counts as like real research, and then like that's not really real research. And Ernest Boyer argued that there is no one best research approach. Now you may disagree with that, but he promoted four different types of research. And just really quickly, I'm going to summarize what those are. So one is like experimentation, or the research of discovery. This is when you test variables, and what you're trying to do is learn something new about reality. So it's reality testing, for example. And the experiment is the exemplar, and so that's considered like the best empirical type of research, or at least that's the general opinion. But Ernest Boyer was trying to argue that, yes, that's important, but it's not universally important. There are other things that complement it. And so the next one is integration. Think of review essays, when you understand a lot of different studies and how they fit together. So you read one research report, and by pairing it with another research report, this research report, though, discovered something different. By putting them together, you're actually able to interpret both of them differently. And by adding them, you're getting something new. And so that's like hermeneutic research, that you're interpreting how they may fit together and say something different based on that context. Then there is the research of application, or clinical research. So maybe scientists have discovered a certain impact of a chemical on diet, or a chemical on weight loss or weight gain, and so applied research would actually take that finding and try to put it into a context of helping people, or putting it into a context where it can be useful. So you learn about a chemical leading to weight loss. All right, so let's see if we can use that in type 2 diabetes patients to get their weight down and to help control their uncontrolled diabetes. And so that would be an applied research. In the classroom, that might be taking learning styles, something that people have discovered, maybe educational psychologists have discovered about learning styles, and then putting it into practice. So research suggests that students who have one-on-one contact with faculty advisors do better or have higher GPAs. Maybe that was found in an experiment setting, and so that's taken and applied to 500 students, and so that would be research of application. So it was applied, how did it work out? And then finally, we have scholarship of teaching and learning. This is what I would call program evaluation. It's very similar to what I just described with clinical or applied scholarship of application. You're taking a teaching strategy, in this example is what we'll talk about, taking a teaching strategy, you're implementing it into your classroom, and then you're going to collect data to see if you've had the outcome that you're hoping for. That's what I want to focus on during this workshop. So I think experiments or scholarship of discovery, I think that's really important, and that should continue, but that would require a certain amount of experimental training and a lot of preparation. You'd have to go through the institutional review board process, because you will be manipulating variables. You will be subjecting some of your students to an experimental condition and some to a control condition, and there are ethical considerations to take into account, and so forth. So that should continue, but that's not what I want to talk about. I want to move down to that number 4 one, that is scholarship of teaching and learning. And in this case, we'll be looking specifically at program evaluation. It's what you are already doing, most likely. You are already reading about strategies for your classroom outside of class. And you're trying to figure out how best to put them into practice in your classroom. Now is where you can collect data to see if you're having the impact that you think that you're having. So this is general accountability. So I want to talk a little bit about why that is so important, and I'm going to pick on myself for that. So I apologize if my cheeks start to get red, but I want to talk about a little bit of what I did my first 7 years teaching. I'll be honest. So I'm on my 8th year. So this is my entire teaching career for the most part. I was really inspired by humanistic and existentially oriented educators. Carl Rogers was a big one. Malcolm Knowles was a big one. Alfred North Whitehead, Martin Buber. These were figures. If you were in my office, you'd see like their pictures. I've drawn pictures of them. They're surrounding me. I've got William James and Hermann Hesse and Fritz Perls. They're here. They're my mentors, and I've tried to integrate their teaching philosophies into my classrooms and bring a lot of passion. And I thought that doing that would improve my students' learning experiences, but I left it at that. So I made all of these changes, these a priori significant changes. So there were philosophical and theoretical reasons to suggest that they would be influential in the classroom, and I implemented them, but I never actually checked to see if my students were benefiting. I wasn't holding myself accountable. When I did start collecting data, feedback from students, submitting or distributing questionnaires to see if students were becoming more creative, if they were becoming more open-minded, if they were becoming more responsible, or if they saw the locus of control as coming from within, they felt like they were the primary mover in their life, what I found was inconclusive. There was not enough evidence to suggest that any change was taking place, and I was putting all this effort into it, which meant not necessarily that the strategy was ineffective, but maybe I wasn't doing a very good job implementing the strategy. So then I had to look at it again and start talking with my students. So how come this isn't happening? Tell me what it looks like from your perspective. And I started getting a lot of feedback. I was overwhelmed with the data that came back in. And when I say data, I don't mean figures and numbers. I mean experiential accounts from students. And so I just sort of swam around in all of this information and tried to reconcile that with what I expected from my classes, and then I began to make changes that were in line with what the data suggested. And again, when I say data, I just mean information from a variety of sources. From that, I was able to design research projects, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning program evaluations. So what happens when I do this? Let's see, here's what I expect to happen. Does it happen? Oh, I'm on the right track. Let's try it again. I'll make a few changes. Oh, I'm seeing more of an improvement. After a few semesters, I start to really nail what that one teaching strategy was directed at. And so I want to talk about how to put that together. So that was a story from my own life of how I thought I was doing a really good job. And I was being really inspired. But when I actually looked at it, the data wasn't in line with what my hopes and expectations were. And so I needed to reevaluate that process. I want to tell one more story, and this is from one of the names that I mentioned earlier, Malcolm Knowles. So he actually was a student of Alfred North Whitehead, which would have been amazing. And then, so he was at Harvard. Then he moved to Chicago and taught at a YMCA. And started working with the Chicago school, so I think John Dewey, later Arthur Shedlin, Carl Rogers. He connected with all of those figures, and based on his relationships with those teachers, he designed a teaching model that wasn't focused on child education, pedagogy. He designed one focused on adult education, or andragogy. And the big difference there was children need to be told what to do. That's how the adult educators frame it. Now, you may disagree that children do not need to be told what to do. They need to be given freedom. And so I don't want to have that argument, and I think there's validity to both sides of it. But the adult educators, following Malcolm Knowles, would say children need to be told what to do. Adults need the freedom to make their own choices. And so he differentiated andragogy from pedagogy. and design courses to do that. One big method, and you can read books about this, was the design of learning contracts or learning plans, where students say, here's what my objectives are for this class, here's how I will pursue them, here's how I'll know once I've succeeded. So they play a role in designing their own objectives, in assessing them and evaluating themselves, designing their activities, choosing topics to pursue. They play a really big role in all of that. And Malcolm Knowles writes in a really creative, engaging, enthusiastic way, and he's very easy to follow along. It's easy for a reader to follow along and think like, wow, I should be doing that too. I can say that from personal experiences. My students in the past will tell you, oh, learning contracts, gosh, I'm going to get a headache. I designed so many learning contracts and made changes and tried to make videos to support all of these processes. And what I was doing was following Dr. Knowles' lead. Now, when I started checking to see how is this working, and I was finding a lot of mixed results, inconclusive data, I went back to, all right, so what did he find? And I didn't find a whole lot of evidence that he showed to demonstrate that andragogy was better than pedagogy. So then I went to his students. What did his students do? Well, a few of them had conducted their own studies, but what they found was, in some cases it's helpful with adults, in some cases not so much. In some cases it's helpful with children, in some cases not so much. It ended up being a wash with the second generation of students. Then we have like the third generation of his students, so we're getting into contemporary time, the last 15 years, and we have a professor of education, John Rashall, who concluded most of the fanfare around andragogy, and again, this is a distant student of Malcolm Knowles, a lot of the fanfare around andragogy is nothing but philosophical inspiration. There's no actual evidence supporting it. That doesn't mean there can't be evidence supporting it. It hasn't been generated yet. There's no study that we could go to say, hey, this is actually preferable. It seems preferable, and the anecdotal evidence might suggest this works, but there wasn't any demonstration of it. In other words, we don't know if andragogy is any better than pedagogy. All we have are, it ought to be better. It seems like it would be better, but that's not good enough. When we're scholars and educators and professors and scientists, we need to hold ourselves to the standard of evidentiary support. It's an arduous and rigorous standard, but it's a basic one. And so one thing that I want to encourage you to do, this is, maybe call this a challenge, but to hold yourself accountable when it comes to teaching. I suspect that you're not implementing teaching strategies arbitrarily. You've chosen the ones that seem to work best. Maybe they've worked best for you, maybe they seem to work best for your students, but don't limit yourself to the seams. Actually demonstrate it, show it, collect data to see if that supports what your expectations are. And what I want to do in this workshop is take you through that process. So the first big step then will be to think of a class that you teach. Obviously, you would like to do this in all of your classes, but you'll quickly find that is a lot of work to take on right away. Don't worry, 5 years down the road, you will have done this in all of your classes, and pretty soon you'll be able to report statistics and data and outcomes for all of these different practices, and then the younger colleagues will say, how did you ever get started with that? And you'll say, I just started one day, and I started in a very simple way, and continued to work on it, and pretty soon it expanded to everything, all the courses that I teach. So step one, choose a class that you're currently teaching, or you will be teaching very soon. This wouldn't really work in the middle of the semester, most likely, unless you're already doing a teaching strategy, and then all you need to do is design a method of data collection. So choose a class that you're teaching, and then pick one teaching strategy that you use in that class that you suspect benefits your students, that it benefits them in some specific way. And there's two things that you're going to have to do. The first thing you're going to have to do is define what your teaching strategy is. It is not enough to say, I give students extra time to work on their quizzes. It is not enough to say, I give students feedback on their essays. You need to be as specific as possible, that if you were to write a paragraph and share that paragraph with your colleagues, they wouldn't have to ask you any questions. They could do exactly what you said. This is called operationalizing a procedure. If you say you give students feedback, describe exactly what you're giving feedback on, the kinds of, maybe give a few examples of what feedback looks like, how much time are you spending on that, what format is the feedback being given in. Be as specific as possible. It's going to seem excessive, but it's really important to make sure what you're doing here is coming up with a standard. Here's the absolute minimum of what I consider giving feedback to students. Could you design a program to give feedback to students? If so, write the program out. I suspect you probably couldn't do that, and so you'll have to do the next best thing, which is describe what you mean by giving feedback. Now, chances are your strategy is a lot more complicated and more well developed than that. So you'll want to talk about where the inspiration is coming from, why you're doing it this way. This is all the a priori support for your teaching strategy. You shouldn't have any trouble doing this because you already have the inspiration. Just go to the sources that it came from, summarize what that is, describe exactly what the strategy is. You might find you can do that in a paragraph, possibly a page, possibly several pages. If this is something you've worked on for a while, it might take you an entire book, and so what you're doing is a program evaluation that will double as a manual for other faculty who may want to do the same thing. So you'll want a step-by-step process. Here's what you'll have to do. So this is the first part. You want to write down exactly, or summarize exactly what the strategy is. That will help you when it comes time to testing the strategy because you'll know exactly what is included in your teaching strategy. The strategy should predict what your outcome is. You're giving students feedback on essays. Why? So this is part 2. Why are you giving students feedback on their essays? Do you want to help them with grammar? Do you want to help them with creative writing? Do you want to help them with critical thinking? Do you want to help them with concision? What is the purpose of that? Do you want to do all 4 of those? If you want to do all 4 of those are 4 separate outcomes. That is a lot of data. So this is one thing I do with my undergraduate research students. They say, yeah, I want to study trauma. I want to study child abuse. I want to study PTSD. It's like, okay, what about these things do you want to study? They're like, I just want to study those things. And so they wind up looking at everything. Pretty soon they've got 1,000 references. They never get to 1,000 references, of course. They get to like 6 and realize they're never going to be able to read everything. And so they come to me and say, how do I narrow this down? So simplify the process for yourself. Make it easy on you by thinking about what your main objective is. So the objective might be the learning outcome for that class. Check the course catalog. What is the learning objective? And how can you assess that? Hopefully your program already has an assessment in place. You can use that assessment and see if your strategy leads to students in your course outperforming students in other courses, or or you can do it new in a course, so implement a new strategy and see if students this semester outperform students from last semester, keeping in mind that you're comparing apples and oranges to a certain extent. These are different years, different semesters. It could be very different learning environments, but what you're doing is collecting data for a baseline comparison. It's more than you had before, and so you're getting that whole process started. So again, step 1, what is your strategy? Can you describe that clearly? Step 2, what outcome do you hope to achieve? I'll give you an example of both of these in a class that I just did. So I organized a program evaluation. I got a couple of students to help me sort through the data and analyze the data and get experience in that whole research process. Here's what I did. It was a general psychology course, and I thought that I could teach something called transactional analysis. So it's a psychotherapeutic technique. It's a really simple one, and I could teach them that during the first week of class, some of the language and transactional analysis, and then teach the first few chapters using the language of transactional analysis. And again, to give you like a really simple example, transactional analysts don't use medical language. They don't use psychiatries, and so they're not talking about like cognition and reaction formation and subliminal messaging. They're saying things like childish behavior, childlike behavior, or prejudicial behavior, things that we already know, words that we're already using. The way that two children antagonize each other, like that's the kind of language that transactional analysts will use. So it's fun, it's engaging, it's really simple. Students don't have to look words up. They know exactly what all of the concepts mean without having to look them up. So I thought using that in a classroom, and there was evidence to suggest this, would increase students' self-awareness. That by practicing using these psychotherapeutic, these transactional analytic concepts in the classroom, dealing with basic psychological concepts, they would start to do that same reflection on themselves, and consequently, they would start to take more ownership of themselves in their lives. So the word for that is responsibility. They would become more self-responsible, or they would have an inner locus of control. So the strategy was teaching these concepts of transactional analysis over the first 4 weeks, and I had lesson plans for each of those. That was the strategy. The outcome was increase in locus of control. Now, how would I go about measuring locus of control? Well, there are actually locus of control questionnaires, which I could have used. I did not use them. I wanted to make it really complicated on myself. So, before I get into what I actually did, let me tell you about what would have been super easy. I could have given students a locus of control questionnaire to get a sense of where students are at. Or I could have given a locus of control questionnaire to a group of students who were not in my class to be a representative comparison sample. And so maybe 35 students between the ages of 18 and 25 in one course, another group of 18 to 25-year-olds in another course. I could give them the locus of control study, and then my group the locus of control study, and compare their results. And then I have a valid instrument that I'm comparing between these two samples. We're not talking about study 1 in Ernest Boyer's levels of scholarship. That's experimentation. This would not pass experimental muster. What I'm doing is a program evaluation, trying to get some evidence to see whether or not my learning objectives are being achieved. So that's what I should have done. It would have been really simple. I decided instead to design my own instrument because it seemed like fun, and I had some undergraduate students to help me. And so I had students free write their goals for college, and then me and my students analyzed their writing to see whether or not their statements reflected their own inner drive, saying things like, never mind, I'm not going to go into detail. I designed my own analytic tool. We evaluated it together, and then the results were inconclusive. I actually have another video where I summarized that. It's I think we have an article in publication right now, so you can read all about how that went. The purpose isn't to tell you all about what I did. It's to provide a template for you to design your own research project around, or program evaluation around, one of your teaching strategies. So let me back up again. The first thing you want to do is define what your strategy is. The second thing, what outcome you expect. And the more specific you can be on both of them, the easier time that you'll have. The best case scenario is you find a measure for your outcome that has already been validated. That means maybe it's a questionnaire, and the questionnaire has been run through so many different students, we're talking tens of thousands of students, that you can say with confidence that a high score on that scale means that this student had a high score on whatever the scale was measuring. To give you a quick example, when I gave this workshop a few days ago, I had a professor, a communications professor, say that he was interested in helping students become less nervous when they gave a speech in public. And so he wanted to measure stage fright. He described stage fright, and it sounded a lot like anxiety, and I asked him, is that the same thing as anxiety? Because psychology has all sorts of anxiety scales that students can take self-report, or you can observe somebody and then check all of the boxes to see whether or not they're exhibiting symptoms of anxiety. And he described that it sounded a lot like anxiety, but stage fright was a little bit different, and so I asked him to see if he could find a questionnaire for that. Was there actually a stage fright inventory that if students took it, you could measure whether or not they had a lot of stage fright, a little bit of stage fright, or no stage fright? If no such questionnaire exists, he might have to design it. But then let's say he chooses 10 questions. If they answer yes, very on all of them, does that mean they have stage fright? If it hasn't been validated yet, we don't know. For example, you could ask a bunch of really simple questions like, are you nervous about what audience will think? And if they say yeah, does that mean they have stage fright? Well, not necessarily. You can be nervous about what someone's thoughts will be about you without being unable to speak or without becoming paralyzed with nerves. But still, concern about what people will think will be a component of stage fright. And so all of those kinds of problems are sorted out when a tool gets validated. So dealing with part 2, what's your outcome, how will you measure it, it's really helpful to have an already validated an already validated tool with tests of reliability and so forth. When I did my own tool, I had to do my own test of reliability. So we did an inter-rater reliability test, and it turns out we weren't very good at using this new tool that I had designed. So it was a great learning experience, and the data itself qualitatively was interesting, but in terms of getting like a quantitative demonstration of the learning outcome I was looking for, not so much. And I actually think it's because the teaching strategy I used didn't have as big an impact as I was hoping. All right, so far, here's what you have done. Hopefully, you have this on your sheet of paper. Maybe you've already started writing your research report. You have described your teaching strategy, what it is that you think will improve student learning or some specific outcome, and then you have defined specifically what that outcome will be. That outcome might be related to the course, but it might not be. So you might be teaching for reasons beyond getting students to matriculate through a college program. It might be more important to you for students to become self-aware or emotionally aware, have emotional intelligence. That's not written into a whole lot of curricula, but we know it's a really important soft skill. So what if you used a teaching strategy that promoted emotional intelligence? Will students develop emotional intelligence? Well, you will need a measure of it. How will you determine whether or not students have developed emotional intelligence, or have the meter has moved at all for these students? And that's when you come up with your measure, your measurement tool, your assessment tool. There are emotional intelligence inventories, by the way, if that's something you want to do. There are inventories for creativity. I suspect there are inventories for spontaneity. I mentioned inner locus of control. I had, autonomy. So students taking responsibility for their own learning. So those are 3 really important humanistic learning outcomes that have validated tools of measurement that are already established that you can use. But then, of course, there's critical thinking tools. There are rubrics that measure critical thinking. American Association of Colleges and Universities have like a dozen different rubrics that have all been normed, and they're helpful for assessing non-quantitative data. So maybe you're evaluating a performance or an essay or a project. And so you're not counting anything, they're not right and wrong answers, but you're looking for where they fall on the rubrics. So the rubrics already exist, and those can be helpful as end of term sort of outcome measurements. I think that's just about everything that I wanted to go through. Those are the two main steps. And once you get through those two steps, you've gone way further than a lot of your colleagues that aren't really interested in holding themselves accountable. So if you have your strategy well defined and clarified and your outcome clear, you'll be able to collect that outcome data and see, did my strategy have the impact I hoped it would? Now, how do you know if they didn't just start the semester really creative or start the semester with lots of emotional intelligence? There are two ways that you can gauge that. Well, actually, there's three ways. You can ask the students. You can get subjective data. Now, how much do students really know? How aware are they really? Well, there are books and articles, and this argument has been going on for centuries. Can we trust the subject? Some argue yes, some argue no, and that'll have to be a personal decision. Just know that enough scholars think that it's okay to ask students about their own experience and take their word for it, and there are ways to sort of measure how reliable their answers are. Enough scholars take that seriously that you will not be laughed out of a conference hall. You might be, depending on the conference. I've been laughed out of a conference hall, just full disclosure. There are enough scholars out there that take seriously the idea that students can self-report information, and that's reliable, that you will get that published, you will have an audience, you will get support through that process. So the first step, ask the students, are you more emotionally intelligent now than you were before? Tell me about it. Step 2, you can do a pre-test, post-test, which means you give them, for example, an emotional intelligence inventory in the first day of class. Tell them, you don't need to know anything about this. This isn't for a grade. You're not being judged here. I just want to see where you're at. And then you give it to them later and see if there was any change. Keeping in mind that if there were 35 students on the first day of class and only 31 students on the last day of class, or 24 students, or 15 students, who do those 15 students represent? And maybe you want to throw out the people who ended up dropping from the first sample so you have a better comparison. The final way you could do it is compare one class to another class. So one thing I did this summer was taught 2 online courses using a new autonomy-supported teaching strategy. And I didn't want to only let one of my classes do it. I wanted to do it with both my classes. But I also wanted to see if my strategy actually supported student autonomy or if I just sort of hoped that it would. And so I had my students take this inventory, and I had a matched pair of another group, so 2 35 classroom students of history students, take the same inventory so that I could compare. So these psych students, here's how supportive they felt, and here are these history students and how supportive they felt. Again, I'm comparing apples and oranges, but if I find that they're identical, then my strategies probably didn't work. If I find that my students felt less supportive, then I had the opposite effect. And if they seemed more supportive, then perhaps it did what I hoped it would do. And again, it's not supposed to be evidence of causality. It's just evidence to support that what I'm doing is actually having the outcomes that I'm hoping that it will have. Now, I'm going to leave this at that so that it might seem incomplete. I've given you those 2 parts of doing a program evaluation to hold yourself accountable, to see if your teaching strategies have the effect that you hope that they're having. The next step will be analyzing the data once you collect it. So I'm just going to give you a couple of hints here, and I guess maybe if I get some feedback, I can do a follow-up video. This will be part 2 of testing or assessing your own teaching and then publishing the results. That would be like video 3. A couple of hints. Trust your intuition when you are looking at that data. You've been through the class. You already have some idea of whether or not students are developing the objective or developing the skill that you're hoping that they'll develop. Now, this intuition will increase the more contact you have with students. So the more you're interacting with them and actually seeing them demonstrate this, the better idea you'll have that they're actually demonstrating this objective. Part 2, there may be an established analytic procedure for you to use. Or so this is hint 2, there may be an established analytic procedure. So if there are, if you're using a questionnaire, maybe you just need to report the statistics from the questionnaire. Here's what the questionnaire had to say. Here's the raw data, and then here's my interpretation of it. Again, use your intuition to interpret that, because you're a teacher. You have a unique perspective on your students in particular. Remember that very first thing that I said? Most of this work has already been done. You're already a teacher. You're already researching strategies. You're already implementing them. You have a lot of it taken care of. Now you're just going to collect some data and see if the data squares with what you think it should be doing. And then finally, once you have all that, it's time to share it. Don't keep it to yourself. You can, of course, keep it to yourself. The objective there is to inform your teaching, to become a better teacher, and then to take what you've learned, integrate it back into your strategy, improve the strategy, go through the process again. But eventually, I would encourage you to make that public. Let others benefit from all of the work that you just put in. And say, hey, here's something that I've done, and here's what happened as a result. Does it have to be a hair-raising finding? No. I try to publish things that don't work out the way I hope they would, because to me that's honest. Hey, I thought this would work. It didn't. Hopefully you'll have better luck. Learn from my mistakes. Move on. It's easy to publish something that's self-congratulatory. Look what I did. Look how wonderful it worked. Look how much my students benefited. But how helpful would it be to also read about the examples of what doesn't work? So you'll say, yeeks, I don't want to make that mistake. We've all done it. We've all had the things that we've tried that blew up. And sometimes it's just the class, and so that can be part of the discussion too. But I want to encourage you to participate in that discussion. Share what you've learned. You can do that at conferences. There can be teaching conferences. They can be conferences in your area, your discipline. You can publish those in teaching journals. You can publish them in journals that focus on the teaching of your discipline, or perhaps a journal of the strategies you're using themselves. There are plenty of outlets. Let me know if there are any specific follow-ups that you want me to do, or if there are any lingering questions, if I left something out, or did a poor job of describing something. Leave comments about that. And then maybe also share some of the strategies that you've used, or program evaluations that you've conducted as a template for others to follow. Hopefully you got something out of that, and perhaps we'll do some follow-ups to that as well.